I really was pleased to be asked to discuss this paper and to read it. It is a really deep dive and look at a really important jobs that involve office and administrative support, and what's the role of technology in impacting those jobs. Now, a lot of our efforts have been turned to looking at what has happened in manufacturing or in the goods producing sector. So I wanted to start by putting this in perspective, that there are more people who work in office and administrative support jobs than in the entire goods producing sector. So this is a really big job that they're taking a look at, and this, and here, this thing didn't work with my click-tos, but so this graph right here really struck me at the beginning of their paper, and they show that the percent, employment in this occupation peaked in the 80s, a little over 16%, and has fallen to like about 12.5% now. And so the reason I wanted to highlight this is their data is, they're starting to look in here, and you might think, well, what are we going to learn looking between 2010 and 2017? But it's about a third of the decline is occurring in their very small sample period. So actually we have a lot to learn by looking in this small sample period, because there's a lot happening during that time. So the question is, that big decline, is it the adoption of technology causing it? Is it to blame? And if it is, what's happening to the remaining workers and to the rest of the labor force? So the big picture that the paper lays out is this idea that we're all familiar with, that technology can be factor augmenting or it can be task replacing. And the authors find that office and administrative workers are, as they're required to use more types of technology in their jobs, the skill requirement to be hired goes up, their wages go up, but overall employment in these jobs goes down. Yet, there seems to be this positive overall effect that overall employment increases in the areas with more technology adoption. So my first question, and I think one of the things I was really looking to see in the paper that wasn't there, was how much of the overall decline in this office and administrative support jobs employment over this period can be explained by the increase in technologies that they're seeing in their data. So we're seeing, we see this huge decline. Well, let's map it out. Is it happening mostly, is this completely explained by variation across the country and technology adoption or not? I'd like to see that aggregated back up to give me a little bit more insight. So I want to just make a couple of brief comments, and I'm going to divide them into two. And the first is just thinking about how we should interpret this particular paper. And I think this paper does a really good job convincingly explaining the impact of technology and adoption on office and administrative jobs between 2010 and 2017. I have a few questions. So I'm going to start by just asking that, does it do a good job? Are there things they could answer better? And then I want to say, what about, here's like the formal way you'd say it, the external validity, or does this tell me anything about the future, right? Does this tell me anything about what's going to happen to these jobs from additional technological change? So their data is completely amazing, right? That 120 million jobs, and they're able to, advertisements, and they're able to look at each one and see what's required. But as the authors acknowledge in the paper, these are not a normal sample. This is an online sample, and they're going to look a little bit different. And you talked a little bit in the paper about how different industries are better represented in these online job ads. And I think it's actually worth thinking a little bit about what you're starting from. What's the starting point? Because you cannot be technology averse, and the first thing you're doing is posting on an online job board, right? So there's already some technology savviness that's leading to that. And so as I said, it's not a random sample, and I guess I'm trying to figure out, is there a difference between adding technology to this administrative assistant? For those of you guys who've seen the movie Sing, this is Mrs. Crawley. Mrs. Crawley is not very good with technology. And I very much fear what happens when we give her technology. She dropped her eyeball on the keyboard and accidentally increased the reward for a singing contest, which she wasn't planning on posting electronically. She was putting these flyers out, right? So what is this? Are we giving technology to Mrs. Crawley, and I'm not sure what she's going to do with it, or are we giving technology to this woman who's an administrative assistant? Look, she doesn't have any technology, but she got a lot going on, right? And so I think if we give her technology, she's going to do something very, very different with it than if we give it to Mrs. Crawley. And what I don't know with this data is if there's anybody starting with Mrs. Crawley's out there that's then advertising for a replacement. Mrs. Crawley really needs to retire. She's got this eyeball that keeps falling out. So are they starting with this person, or did this person just get a promotion and now they need to replace her and they're thinking, let's add some technology requirements to the job? And so I think you just have to think about whether you're starting from a different place and what this actually captures. So the authors say, are very cognizant of thinking about what's driving the adoption. So the first part of the paper is just looking at, as companies add new technology, what happens to their requirements for employment. And so they know, like, all the businesses have access to this technology. Why are some adopting while others aren't? And that is like this sort of, you get this uneasy feeling as you're reading the results. And so they very convincingly move on to a different strategy, which is to look at the rollout of technology in commuting zones by using the increase in technological change that's driven by historical industry mix of the local labor market and the fact that some industries are adopting faster than others. So I think the hope in this is some industries are adopting faster than others because HR software is just somehow being developed and used differently than, say, accounting software. So that there's something that's sort of fundamental to the industry. My concern, my concern is there's something else going on. But let me just start by saying what they find using this approach is the exact same thing, which is more technology equals less employment, more education, more skills, and essentially they confirm a lot of media stories, right? I can't tell you how many media stories I read about the slow death of the secretary. Look at this. A job that once gave a woman a middle-class living is fading away. And if you read this article, it will tell you that the jobs are being upskilled, they need more education, they need more experience, they have to do more work, and it's hard for the 60-year-old Mrs. Crawley. Actually, it's a 65-year-old woman in there. I don't want to say she's like Mrs. Crawley. I'm sure she's more competent. But who can't find another job in this new world because a lot more is being demanded of an administrative assistant. And I've read a lot of those articles, and you essentially find that to be the case. But so let me ask one question that's really directly to your paper and then transition towards thinking about that external validity, which is all software technology the same? So what I was really struck by was the linear specification in which you're just adding up different types of software. And so, we're asking for one sort of technology, now 2, now 3, now 4, now 5. Is that how I want to think about adopting technology, or is there something really different about I never required technology and now I require technology? And some of your industries, there's a lot of places start with 1 and are going to those higher orders, and in some of your industries, like the predominant is 0 and then they're going to 1. And I don't know if I should think about that as having the same kind of effect in the world. Are we going to determine, and this is what turns us straight to the external validity question, if one piece of software is augmenting and leads to higher wages and makes people more productive, does that necessarily mean the next type will be? And I think the answer to that's clearly no, right? And so that's why we have to start thinking about a little bit about what are these different softwares that are being used. And so that's what brings me to this external validity question. So, the paper points out, look, we find something really different from Asimoglu and Restrepo, who say, look, industrial robots really replace people. And that got me really excited about the idea of a robot assistant. Because what if I had a robot assistant? That would be pretty fun. and a robot assistant, would that crowd out my need for a human assistant? I don't know the answer to that, but it might look very different than like Microsoft Word, right? And so I don't think we can say that all technology will be the same when it comes to how it affects people's jobs. So the next thing I want to come to is this distinction between office support versus manufacturing. Is manufacturing somehow different, or is it the technology that's different, right? So I just said, well, look, robots are clearly different, so maybe it's just the technology's different. Or maybe manufacturing is just a lot like agriculture, which was a sector that used technology and then became less important, freeing people to do other things, right? We don't work in agriculture anymore, and it's a shrinking industry. The goods sector is really, really shrinking. So if you take a look at this over that period where you showed, the service sector, the administrative jobs rose and then declined, we've seen a huge shift away from goods-producing jobs towards service-producing jobs. So should we expect to see technology play a different role in an industry that is growing and expanding rapidly to one that is shrinking? And I think what I was left with wondering is what's playing a role here. So now I'm going to come back to that question of then when you use your instrument, you're looking at the industry's speed of adoption of softwares. Is that actually, can we say that's driven by some exogenous force, or is that driven by something else that's driving whether the industry is expanding or contracting? And is that something that we need to be concerned about? So the comparative advantage can shed some insight. And I spent some time trying to think about this because I spend a lot of time thinking about 101 concepts because I just wrote an Principles of Economics textbook. And so, the thing I hammer into my students is everybody has a comparative advantage. And so if service jobs are increasing and continue to increase, will there always be a need for support staff? Not because the technology is not doing a good job of making people more productive or even replacing tasks, but won't I always be able to shed something so I can focus more on my comparative advantage and give something to an assistant? Won't assistants look a whole lot different in a world in which I'm more productive and have more technology than they looked in, say, 1960 or 1970? And so, I started thinking about, what if we have robots answering phones and emails and keeping track of billable hours in law firms? Will lawyers still benefit from support staff? And the answer to that, I think, is still going to be yes, just because there's got to be a sense of comparative advantage. And as long as, there are some people with higher marginal product of labor than others, somebody's going to look like somebody's supporting somebody, right? That a support staff is, that gets us to my last sort of question, which is, do jobs evolve or die, right? And so what causes a job to evolve rather than dying? And so, we could, it sort of gets to this really esoteric question of what is a job title? A job title is a collection of tasks. Can we keep having that title even if every single one of the tasks in it changes? Maybe, depends on how much we like the title, right? So I think we'll keep around the title vice president probably forever. People like that title. The title secretary seems to be dying. That doesn't really have to do with the collection of tasks as much as sort of the sexist underlying connotations of it. And so it gets really hard as us, the people trying to measure things, looking at job titles. This is no critique to you or your co-author. This is just us trying to measure it, is we're putting these tasks under occupational titles, and then whether we keep that title or not is not necessarily driven by how much those tasks are changing or not changing. At least I don't think, and I would love to see someone do the research, is there some tipping point where the tasks have changed so much that we kill the occupational name? So with that, I will conclude. So I think this is a very thorough and deep look at the evolution of office support jobs and the role technologies plays in raising wages and decreasing employment and upskilling. But what are we going to do in the future? Authors argue that administrative jobs aren't going away. I agree with them, but I don't think I'm learning that from your work. I think I'm learning it from, I still believe it based on my priors from first principles, that there will always be somebody needing to support someone. And I think underlying all that, it's because most people, not just me, I didn't just put my personal goals here at the end, want to work less, be more productive, and do work that provides meaning. So if everybody's sort of pursuing these goals, I think there's always going to be, and we're largely service-based economy in developed countries, I think there's always going to be a role for office and administrative support workers. Thank you.